I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of contemporary poetry and poetics to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, or maybe disagree a lot, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for a poem that interests us some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our PennSound archive, writing.upenn.edu/PennSound. PoemTalk's engineer, director, editor, Zach Cardner, and I have once again taken PoemTalk on the road, and we are happily here today in Los Angeles, California, in Pacific Palisades, to be exact, at the lovely home of Marjorie Perloff. And Zach and I are joined by Susan McCabe, professor in the Creative Writing and Literature program at USC, a native of Los Angeles, who was indeed born on Sunset Boulevard.
Exactly.
Really, truly?
Truly.
Not far from where we're sitting.
Permanent.
Whose books include a study of Elizabeth Bishop's Poetics of Loss and Cinematic Modernism, Modern Poetry and Film, published by Cambridge in 2005, and whose books of poetry include Swirl, 2003, and Descartes' Nightmare, 2008, and who is currently finishing a dual biography of H.D. and Breyer for Oxford, whose current poetry book is titled Fates, Taking Up the Uneasy Connection Between Technology and Ecopoetics, and by Robert von Hallberg, professor of English at Claremont McKenna College, co-editor of the journal Modernism Modernity, among whose many, many books are Lyric Powers, Literary Intellectuals and the Dissolution of the State, Conversations in Germany, 1990-1992, American Poetry and Culture, 1945 to 1980, a book still very close to me on my shelf that I consult. An earlier book on Charles Olson, an important long section on poetry, politics, and intellectuals, published in Sack Van Berkovich's Cambridge History of American Literature, with innumerable essays on Ceylon, later Creeley, libertarian imagism, Ed Dorn, Paul Metcalf, Williams in the 30s, etc., etc., etc. And by the aforementioned Marjorie Perloff, our host for today's PoemTalk, whose many important critical and scholarly books include, just to name some of them randomly, The Dance of the Intellect, Wittgenstein's Ladder, The Futurist Moment, and whose recent book is Edge of Irony, Modernism in the Shadow of the Habsburg Empire, a book that is now, as of this recording, out in paperback. I'm happy to say congratulations. And among whose most recent poetry-related essays and activities are an article on Susan Howe's late style, a course of lectures at the T.S. Eliot Summer School, and the annual Little Gidding Lecture, Summer 2017, to be published soon in Raritan. Recent keynote talks delivered in Kunming, China, and Singapore, and a new essay on Beckett's poetry for a collection to be called The New Beckett. Marjorie, thank you for having us over to your house.
My pleasure, Al.
It's great to see you. Susan, thank you.
Thank
Do you have
you.
an elevator pitch on the H.D. Breyer bio?
Well, no one has ever sort of interrelated their lives, and
Yeah.
it's quite a weaving act.
Yeah.
And I'm smack in the middle of World War II right now, and I think
Tough time for both of them, I think.
very much so.
Yeah.
And they're in and out of each other's way, and going to Cornwall or going to Eckington and Cambridge occasionally, but really living through the war.
Yeah, great.
And what it does to poetry is interesting, and I think it sort of Ashbery is a kind of response in a certain way.
Great.
In some ways.
Well, I hope that anyone who encounters this conversation will expect and await that book. And Bob, quickly, you have been working on a big collection of essays. Are you at liberty to say anything about
Yeah. Well, of
hopeful-
course. Yeah, this is a collection of essays, evaluative essays on poetry since 1950, and an effort to nudge critics to sort things out a little bit more. It's a big fat book because there's not been a lot of sorting.
Right.
And we've got a long list of contenders for survival in this among
and
poets.
poetry and value is one of your consistent interests and
Yes,
hallmarks
it is.
across the year.
Thanks for asking. Yes.
Well, Thank you all for being here. Well, today we four have gathered here at Marjorie's home to talk about a late and seemingly minor, or maybe not seemingly, maybe absolutely minor poem.
Or not.
That appeared in a 2012 book of poems called Quick Questions by John Ashbery, a collection not much commented upon, somewhat reviewed, and not all that favorably reviewed. The poem is called The Short Answer, and it appears on pages 5 and 6 of Quick Question. And Quick Question, that book has not been collected into any kind of collected poems because this has all happened recently. Although at readings in 2011, 2012, 2013, Ashbery read many poems from this book, some of them again and again. He only read this poem once that we know of, which may be indicative, not sure. Our recording comes from PennSound's vast Ashbery page from a reading given at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst on September 20th, 2012. So here now is the late John Ashbery reading The Short Answer.
The short answer. I am forced to sleepwalk much of the time. We hold on to these old ways, are troubled sometimes, and then the geyser goes away, time gutted. In and of itself, there is no great roar, force pitted against force, that makes up in time what it loses in speed. The waterfalls, the canyon, a royal "I told you so" comes back to greet us at the beginning. How was your trip? Oh, I didn't last, you see, folded over like the margin of a dream of the thing in itself. Well, and what have we come to? A paper-thin past, just so, and 'tis pity. We regurgitate old anthems, and what has come to pass, and why dwell on these? Why make things more difficult than they already are? Because if it's boring in a different way, that'll be interesting too. That's what I say. That rascal, he jumped over the fence. I'm wiping my pants, nay, now. Did you ever hear from the one who said he'd be back once it was over? Who eluded me, even in my sleep? That was a particularly promising time, we thought. Now the sun's out and it's raining again, just like a day from the compendium. I'll vouch for you, and we can go on scrolling as though nothing had risen. The horizon forest looks back at us. The preacher shook his head. The evangelist balanced 2 spools at the end of his little makeshift rope. We'd gone too far. We'd have to come back in a day or so.
So I'd like us to start by each of us just tossing out a classic Ashberian move, turn, trope, ambiguous antecedent, just to connect this to the Ashbery that we know for decades. Is pick something. Susan, you want to start? What's a typical Ashbery move that you see?
There's so many classic Ashbery moves here.
Yeah, just name
all
one
of
to start.
the enjambments and the ending on, say, an article or one single word. The constant medial stops and then the lurching into the enjambment, forcing you to keep going.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of the enjambment, how that works?
Well, for instance, what have we come to?
That's a classic. Yeah.
I mean, that's a wonderful move because it's so conversational, and that's the other thing. And it's as if he makes a pact with the reader that this is going to be a conversation, and you're going to understand it, and so you go along with it.
And then you don't understand.
That's
okay.
right.
Marjorie, classic Ashbery?
Well, the Ashbery signature is one of his books is called Paradoxes and Oxymorons. Right. Oxymorons and paradoxes, rather.
Right.
And you have that all the way here. And facetious parodic statements from the very first line. Nobody can force you to sleepwalk. Sleepwalk is something people try to get you not to do.
Right.
And nobody forces you to sleepwalk.
Right.
So I'm forced to sleepwalk much of the time, and it's always reversing expectations so that, and it's almost become a little bit of a tick here when you say, now the sun's out and it's raining again. it's become a little bit too obvious that the earlier Ashbery didn't quite do that, but he does it very well in some places. For instance, that rascal, he jumped over the fence. I'm on the fence. Ashbery is always taking whatever the cliches of the culture are. I'm on the fence on this issue.
Right.
Well, that rascal jumped over the fence.
Right.
So you're not on the fence. And every line almost has the past, but it's a paper-thin past. And the thing is not the thing itself, the Ding an sich, but the thing in itself. So just when you think, oh, we're getting the good old familiar, the thing itself, you get the thing in itself,
Right.
which is wrong. So there's always a way of stopping the reader and saying, you're going to hear something familiar, but you're not, because this
Right.
is a story about things that don't work out the way they should.
Perfect. Bob, add something to that?
I think I'm going to wind up saying something close to what Marjorie just said, in that what I'd stress is that that's what I say, which is the end of the first half of the poem, and the thing about that is that it's shop-worn language. It's a formulation, as is what have we come to, and these are disavowed formulations. They're disavowed insofar as they are acknowledged to be banal or too common. But the thing about his poetry that appeals to me, and that actually I think connects him to Auden, is that he actually is interested. I believe you may contradict me, but I believe he's interested in wisdom. I think he actually means to be reflecting on the meaning of life and what it comes to, and in this poem about growing old, I think, and that's what I say is amusing and funny if you know Ashbery,
But sincere too, yeah.
but sincere and ironic too, and
Yeah.
that kind of romantic irony is a prominent feature, always has been, of his work, and in some ways it can be beautiful. Yeah.
I'll add two to our list very quickly. One is, of course, the words like it and these that aren't quite prepared for. I mean, the early Ashbery would really screw you up by saying it, and you had no idea what the antecedent was. The second line, we hold on to these old ways. Well, it seems to be the nights of sleepwalking. It seems to be, and old ways is a funny way of thinking about if there's a connection to the previous line. These is very disconcerting, and the same with we regurgitate old anthems and what has come to pass. And why dwell on these? Well, these is probably the old anthems, but you haven't really adjusted to what those old anthems might be, and you wonder maybe these is something else. Okay, that's one, and the other is the trope of the trip. He's always talking about, we went on a trip, we came back from a trip, we went on a trip, we got lost on the trip, I forgot we were on a trip. It's just one of those things. So can we talk about the second half of the first stanza, from well down to that's what I say? Marjorie, maybe you're first.
Where are you?
From well, and what have we come to? A paper-thin fast, just so. We regurgitate old anthems. I'll just make a suggestion and you can respond. I wrote in the margin here, meta poetry. I think he's maybe referring to these poems or to poems at this point in his career, or the late poems, or the regurgitation of old anthems strikes me that he's talking about his poetry.
Yes.
Insofar as that's true, what would we want to say about that?
But he's used that phrase in earlier
Yes.
poems
Oh, yeah.
too.
Yes, many
Regurgitate
times.
old anthem. It's always the past. I mean, notice the whole poem, of course, is very much concerned with the relation of past to present and future, and that's why trips are so important. And there's always, how do you deal with the past? So you're always regurgitating old anthems, and he's used, I think, that very locution before, or ones just like it. But he always makes it a little different. Why make things more difficult than they already are?
Can you explain
Which is
that
a
line?
surprising line in a way. And if it's boring in a different way, but everything, of course, also is elusive. One of the reasons Ashbery is so hard to imitate, I think, it's like what talking about Frank O'Hara, but one of the things that's so hard to imitate is that he's so literary. When you get just so and 'tis pity, where you have "'Tis pity she's a whore," or "'Tis pity," obviously
Right.
there are always allusions to Renaissance texts, to Baroque texts, to whatever it is. And if it's boring in a different way, that'll be interesting too. I think is an allusion to Cage, because it's Cage, who was a great friend of Ashbery's, who said, try something for a minute, it'll be boring. Try for 5 minutes, it'll be less boring. Try for 10 minutes, it'll become very interesting. So I can't help thinking that's an allusion to that it's boring, but it can become very interesting. So everything is equivocal. You think it's your usual sort of romantic exploration of the past, but of course it's never really quite coherent, which doesn't mean, and I agree with Bob, that he isn't very concerned about finding the meaning of the past.
Right. But Bob, the thing that might be boring and the regurgitated old anthems might be, as for instance, this poem. It's possible that he's aware that he is just doing the same thing again and again. Do you want to, I mean, you nodded yes when I suggested it was a metapoetic passage.
Yes. So I take it that, and why dwell on these? You understood that to refer back to the anthems,
Right.
but I think it also refers to, and what has come to pass. That is, what do old men say? They say, "Look what it has come to pass." And I think he's saying, why make dying and getting old any more difficult than it already is?
And what is the connection of that sentiment to the fact that, quick question, was reviewed by some people to the effect that, well, he's a great poet. Maybe he shouldn't publish so much, or maybe these things are churned out. Is there something in there that he kind of almost anticipates? Bob and then Susan?
I think John Hollander said a long time ago that trouble with Ashbery's work is that on one page you have John Ashbery, on another one you have John Trashbery, and then he seems not to make this distinction, and
not want to.
And I think it has something to do with an ironic stance toward the whole project of writing, explaining, and making art. And
Let's stay on this topic. Susan first, then Marjorie. I'll just reveal how Marjorie and I picked this. We thought, let's do a late poem and not a major poem. Let's try something that's a little unexpected, a little out of the way. I picked the short answer. I think Marjorie and I agreed a later book, quick question. And this is an unusual choice for PoemTalk in the sense that we picked somewhat randomly, I would say. And I think that's significant, for me, in a positive way.
Yeah. Actually, all this talk about this being a lesser poem of Ashbery, I mean, I'm reading this and I feel that it's of a piece with the whole body of work. And what I learned from looking at this poem so carefully, and in particular those lines that you want me to address, is that he's really forcing you to be in the moment. And so if you think about Wallace Stevens saying poetry helps us live our lives, what I think Ashbery does is he forces us to stay in the moment of the line. And so we can't dwell anywhere. And so those lines that you read in particular, I want to address, is that this come to pass is very carefully unspooling from the two lines before of what have we come to, and then later going into the promising time. So it's as though he's constantly pivoting between a past and a present that's never stable. We only have this paper-thin moment, and he forces the reader. And so this language of anthems does go back to his earlier work, which is his theme, and though it's enhanced by having this, quote, compendium that we can put our past into and regurgitate into, but we're still stuck in the moment, in this precarious moment.
Marjorie? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Bob?
What do you think about the use of the word regurgitate? I mean, it's an ugly
that's
ugly
kind of
notion.
It's a negative word, right?
So why?
I think it's self-doubt, self-criticism.
Well, I just think that there's no point
I mean,
in
because if it's boring in a different way, that'll be interesting too. That's that Cagean thing that Marjorie was talking about. And so he's the first one to say, I'm just going to keep doing this again and again, and at some point, I myself am going to find it interesting.
But I think 2 points. One, to come back to your point about, is he aware that he's writing maybe the same old thing again? No, I don't agree with you on that. I don't think he's thinking of that at all. I think, he just keeps on writing. He's driven to write, and he doesn't think, oh dear, maybe I'm just doing what I've already done. We can think that, but I don't think he thinks that way at all. And I think the other thing you have to remember here is the title. And quick question, is a similar title, these short titles, because the titles are, wonderfully ironic in a certain way. The short answer, when I say, the short answer is, there never is a short answer.
Not to John Ashbery. Anyway.
Anybody who says that is always really cutting because they don't really want to get into it.
When someone sends you an email, Dear Marjorie, I have a quick question.
And you say the short answer is you're really fudging, right?
Right.
I mean, and that's what he's doing here. The short answer, there is no short answer to all these problems.
Right.
But the other thing that's very important is, to come back to the moment, is that you're catching him in the middle of a conversation.
Right.
Now, maybe
Always.
I'm aware of this because I knew Marlon, he really did talk that way. He's talking to a friend or a group of friends. They're sitting around. They're not
Right.
doing very much. They're sitting around drinking. It's raining, but it's sunny, but it's raining again. And they're kind of thinking and plotting things out. And how was your trip? And notice he read it that way, not how was your trip. How was your trip? You're in the middle of somebody's conversation, and that's what I say, and he's sort of asserting himself, but not quite, but it's also somebody talking to people who know exactly what he's all about, that understand what the discourse here is, because it wouldn't really fit for everybody. And so then when he says, I'll vouch for you, it doesn't even matter who you is, but it's actually just the way people have a scene and say, okay, well, you do this, I'll vouch for you, and then you get the little narrative. Now, what's different in the later poetry, and this is definitely different, is there's much less narrative, but there's still narrative. The early poems, my favorite book is Houseboat Days. We all came and we did this, and at the sign of the antiques, we turned right. There are always stories, and wonderful stories, fairy tale stories, And here, you just have the edge of stories,
Yes.
but you still
Yes.
have narrative.
Yes.
You still have the rascal who jumped over the fence,
You have
things
the preacher
happen.
and
the preacher,
Well, I
which is
wanna-
very interesting.
Yeah.
The preacher shook his head. I don't know. The evangelist bounced
That's
too
a story.
And
That's
make
a
sure, but
story.
we'd gone too far. We'd have to come, and of course, we've gone too far, and take that cliche phrase, but then changes it. We'd have to come back in a day or so, which has nothing to do with going too far in this case. So there always is a narrative, as he said about Gertrude Stein, and open him up to narrative
Yes,
possibilities. There's the thread. There's always in Ashbery, which makes him very different from so many poets of his generation, because there's always a bit of narrative, which you don't always have.
Don't you
And
always
narrative is
also
important.
find, to go back to your earlier question about signatures, don't you find that there's along with what you're saying, always a bit of whimsicality?
Yeah.
So that
absolutely.
with the short answer, you can almost stop with the first line, because if that is the
short answer,
I am forced to sleepwalk much of the time. And I was struck by, you're saying the forcing, no one can force you, but he could have just written, I sleepwalk much of the time.
Right.
So he puts two anapaests on that line. So you almost have to stop at that first sentence there and realize that these three words, force, sleepwalk, much, time, are really going to be driving this poem, actually, I think. I mean, being a sleepwalker mid-time, never settled in one place or another, never dwelling. It's a poetics of non-dwelling.
I understood the poem to be an answer to the question, how are you?
That's what I was going to say. Well, what is the question?
What
is the
I mean,
short
this goes
answer?
back to Stein, actually,
Well, how was
when
your
she
trip?
died on her
Yes.
deathbed. She said, well, what is the question?
Yes.
The short answer,
Right.
And I understood I am forced to sleepwalk. I did puzzle over that in the way that you were saying, Marjorie, like nobody's forced to sleepwalk, right?
Right.
But as a statement about how I'm going through the motions.
Right.
Then it makes sense.
Absolutely.
Then it makes sense to say I'm forced to
Going
in order
through the
to
motions.
in order to
Yes.
get
And
through.
they're also like all the phrases you really hear, but just slightly off, because if it were, well, how are you? I'm forced to sleep most of the time. I'm
Right,
sick
exactly,
right now,
exactly.
So I have to sleep.
That's what you
would
would
be
expect.
completely normal. I'm forced to sleep much of the time, and then you realize it's
Yeah.
sleepwalk, which throws it off. So that's what he does. We hold on to these old ways, are troubled sometimes, and then the geyser, which comes as a great surprise. And I'm not myself sure what to make of the geyser.
Yeah.
What did
I
everybody
took it
make
as
of that?
I took it as an uprising of discontent and of that which is repressed by going through the motions.
The geyser.
Yeah, and
And it doesn't go away, Bob. I mean, it becomes a roar and then a waterfall.
Time is got
No, there's no great roar.
He says, the roar is negative, and, but I mean, you've got water going up and water coming down with the waterfalls.
Well, it's force
there.
against force.
Yeah, and the geyser goes away, time gutted, and I wanted to say something. I like this part of the poem a lot, and I was reminded that of Verlin Klingenborg, a prose writer, has a great book about writing prose, and he says the life of writing is in the white space between sentences. That's where that's where one has to take a leap, and with the leap, the mind is engaged, and hence conjunctions are death itself. You know, don't do it. Don't write, however. You know, let the connection be implicit, and that's a feature of his style. I like the first part, and I wish he didn't publish the narrative part at all. The first part's more discursive.
Well, actually, it sort of leads up to that. But with your earlier idea about this being sort of a poem, I guess you were sort of saying it's sort of philosophical meditation on aging.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of works for me. But it's a very ironic look at all of these sort of notions of the second coming, say, with the scrolling as though nothing had risen. And there's a lot of biblical language in this
There certainly
poem.
is.
And but what it is ironized in a way. But the line that I would like us to talk about, which puzzled me quite a lot, comes right after this geyser, is the force pit against force that makes up in time
What it loses.
and
in
so
speed.
that little phrase really compels me, and to me feels like the core of the poem in a sense.
You got to tell me what that is, because that's I got a question mark there, because I don't know what it means.
Makes up in time when it loses in speed. Well, so what would that be? Throughout the poem, there's all these indeterminacies of time. There's all these muches and so forth, and ways of measuring that don't work out. So don't you think he's referring to the speed of light, and that if you would go faster than the speed of light, you would be stopped in space, and you would then have no time. You would be...
I like that reading, but I have a different one.
Okay.
I really don't want to push this, but
Then don't.
okay.
No, go.
So I'm the host. Actually, Marjorie's the host, so she can determine whether this is worth pushing. But I see the first part of this poem as a contemplation on what it's like to be a poet at this moment for him. So it's partly age and time. And the second half of that first part strikes me, as I said before, as very much a contemplation about what it's like doing this particular thing, this particular regurgitation. And I see the second poem as a break, and then in a way, okay, now I'm going to start my poem. I've cleared my throat, and what I have lost in speed. So I think this is an old person poem. This is a late style. What I have lost in speed, I have made up in time. The force in my poetry now is not in that crazy dynamism of just the relentlessness of this early. So, and then the rascal, he jumps over the fence, is the starting of the story. But he wants, Ashberian, he wants to include the work it took to get to that. And so I find this very moving. I find it very moving that he is going to vouch for us.
Did he what?
That he will vouch for us or for you, whoever he's...
See, only you in the poem, and I wonder about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to push that too hard, but I feel like that little...
I disagree about the poet. I think I think it is, the short answer, it's almost like anyone, when of course it's about old age. Well, how are you? How have you been? I'm forced to sleep sleepwalk most of the time. We hold on to these old ways. All these things are wrong with me. And making up in time what it loses in speed. And the royal, I told you so. But it's not necessarily about being a poet. I think you're reading that in a little bit because he is a poet. I think it's
Doesn't he always write about poetry?
visiting somebody. He's always, first of all, talked about poetry. We see us as we truly behave. I mean, from the very first book, they're all about, if you wish, metapoetic. But I can take it much more practically. It's somebody, when you come in and you see an old man and he's having a hard time and he's in bed or whatever, what have you been doing? How are you? Are you able to do anything? And he's sort of playing around with it. And how was your trip? I didn't last, you see. Folded over like the margin. They always make almost sense. It's almost, see, I think I will take the line that I remember, who was it? That it was Martin Esslin, perhaps, who they said, well, for realism we do, for fantasy we do Brecht, and for realism we do Beckett. And getting as opposed to all the people who thought Beckett was so fantastic, I think it's a very realistic poem. That's what I would argue.
Bob, what do you think about all this?
To me, it's quite realistic.
I think so too. I do. I think it is realistic and about growing old and growing into vacancy too. Not just. I mean, I like what you said about losing speed and losing dexterity and however one wants to. But
gaining time somehow.
But gaining accumulated time. Yeah, I like that. But when he says, "I'll vouch for you," and we can go on scrolling as though nothing had risen. Scrolling is not the word you expect. The word you would expect would be strolling, which would be the conventional one. But what does it mean to go on
scrolling? Computer.
Strolling together, arm in arm, or something. We'll go on.
That's a very good point. We can go on strolling as though nothing had risen.
Yes.
And something similar is.
And you mishear it slightly. So every time you mishear, and by the way, the horizon forest. What is a horizon forest?
A forest on the horizon.
On the horizon.
That's
what I thought. So the forest is on the horizon, and you sort of see it, but not quite. And in general, and the preacher. What about the evangelist?
Oh my God! I have something to say about that little bit of flat surrealism. The evangelist balances two spools at the end of a makeshift rope. So I drew it, I described it, I couldn't do it. That's the Ashbery that I first encountered. A little bit of, I say surrealist, that's not the right word quite, but impossible tomfoolery. The description here, it's really hard to pull off, but he does it right at the end.
You have two spools at the end of a makeshift rope, no? You have a rope and the two little ends.
But you've got an evangelist balancing the spools at the end. Describe
the
that for
questions
me.
Are religious. In
You're
the
more of an
basically,
engineer than I am.
What is life, or what is the meaning of life?
Right.
And the two spools, the two fates, the two weights, the two spools. I can picture a rope with two spools at the end.
And future.
No? The rope ends in a.
Yeah, I
two
can
spools?
see two spools there. And the spool of time, the spool that's been unwound and this rewinding.
But it's a little makeshift rope.
But that's again his, I guess, ironizing the biblical or
intimations of immortality, trying to see something and you can't quite.
Well, let me spool back my comment just a little bit, speaking of spools. I think there's a sign, my point was that there's a sign of acuity and energy in that image. Right? And it's as if he's saying, I think of Jimmy Durante at the opening of a silly 1960s movie called It's a Mad, Mad, Mad World. They find him, there's been a car accident, they go to see him and he looks dead and they say, I guess he's dead, and he says, I'm not dead yet. I'm still alive, right? And I see, or Wallace Stevens at the very end, he's saying, these long lines, I can barely write the long lines, the end of the imagination. And then he says, wait a minute, I just imagined that. I'm still able to do this. There's a way in which I see the end of this poem as kind of performing that he still can do what he's always done.
So
no, okay, all right.
He's not the evangelist. I mean,
no.
Is this a characteristic of? Is this a characteristic of his style that he has figures that are that don't feel quite right?
Yes.
That's what you were saying about because I think about this as there's an element of bad writing because Orwell speaks of exactly that in Politics in the English Language. And he says the trouble with people's use of figures is they don't really think in those figures. They haven't thought it through. And so they're kind of fake figures. So better you should have a plain style and don't use a figure unless you're really into it. And he uses figures, I think, sometimes that way.
But it's a kind of fairy tale almost.
That's
The preacher,
surprise.
you think, and he's so steeped in all those stories, and then it's a story like Hawthorne or something. The preacher shook his head.
But are they
The
two
evangelist-
separate characters, the preacher and the evangelist?
Not necessarily.
They could
You don't
be.
know.
There's a little
but you don't have
fable
to
there,
answer that
isn't there?
question.
There is
You
a
don't have to
fable.
answer
There
that
is a
question. It's a little
fable.
fable. The preacher shook his head, but clear there are people here who are trying to tell the truth or find out what's happening, and they don't know. The preacher shook his head. The evangelist balanced two spools. Isn't that like
At the end.
every omen, the three caskets or the two,
Two
spools
spools.
at the end of a little makeshift rope, but nothing comes of it. You try to
That's
find
so
too
Ashberian.
far.
What is
the
being
answer, and you can't
evangelized?
find
Obviously,
it.
we don't
And that's
know.
the short
but-
answer. Maybe in the short answer, you don't know what those spools are going to have. Spools, which is such a fair, the idea of two spools.
It's an almost
and
an
then we've
antique
gone
word.
too far.
Yeah, well,
so we
just-
don't know. The evangelist is giving us the word. It makes you think of in Melville the hymn, or the preacher.
It does make me
does
think of
something,
Melville.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody's going to come and give you the word, the short answer or the long answer, but they don't. It's just a makeshift rope, not a good rope.
It's interesting
And
that-
we'd gone too far, and we'd have to come back in a day or so. In other words, you always have to come back. There is no truth, and you come back and you'll learn maybe more.
This is really vintage Ashbery. Really.
What?
Right.
This is
Well,
really
that was-
vintage Ashbery.
Exactly.
It is.
Well, that was a
Nobody else
particularly
writes that way.
promising time, we thought. I mean,
Yeah.
so there's another very Ashbery
Yeah.
moment.
Yes.
That was a particularly promising time, we thought. But
Yes.
now we're in the moment again. And so I do think this is sort of this constantly catching oneself from falling over. You're a sleepwalker and in the lines, and you're trying to constantly recover your
Yeah.
balance, in a sense, through these.
I mean, from his very first poem, you have everything has a schedule if you can find out what it is. And that, I think that's such a wonderful line. And you have that, you still have it here. Everything has a schedule, but you don't know what it is. You don't know how to answer. You don't know the short answer or the long answer. You try, though. Everybody tries.
Yeah,
And he
yeah.
tries, but I don't think it's so much about, am I still a poet? Because I think he takes that as a given,
Yes,
that he's a poet.
yes.
I don't think Ashbery is somebody who worries about, oh my goodness, do I still have it? You know.
Well,
he
appearances
fake
of everything,
worries.
right?
He fake worries all the time. I think of a poem called "The One Thing That Could Save America." It's not
Yeah.
a great poem, but there he says, and of course it's very much like this. There is no one thing. There is no
Right.
short
No.
answer. Right.
There's no
the
thing
one
in
thing that
itself.
can save. You see a poem like that and you think, oh, I should read and find out what John Ashbery thinks is the one thing that could save America. And then in that poem he says, the problem with me is that I braid my thoughts too much. I can never come out straight. I think that's the extent to which
I think that's right.
why make things more difficult than they already are? Why, oh John, here you go again. I think he is faux concerned, a little bit concerned that he can never get it straight, that there is no
Well,
short
I don't
answer.
remember the poem, but the line where he says that appearances are almost everything, which goes
Right.
to your point of like
Right.
not being quite, but
Right.
being very concerned about the presentation,
Right.
as you're suggesting, in
Right.
some sense.
And he purposely uses wrong words, as you said, just like a day from the compendium. It's not a day from the calendar. It's not a day from, why the compendium?
I
mean,
love
you don't
that
have a
line.
compendium.
Bob,
that-
did you,
Yeah, I
you,
love that
you
line
said
too.
something about that line earlier, I think.
You did?
You did.
Yeah.
Just like a day from the compendium.
Compendium.
I just feel like
It's like
it's
it's-
almost a scriptorium. I feel
Yes.
like
some sort of
Yes.
void.
there's that.
of-
I'm sorry, I keep pushing the metapoetic, but I feel like it's a writing room. Anyway, Bob, you were going to say?
I do think what he's saying there, and maybe this is just obvious, is just like the past, the known past, the collection
Right.
of stories, the known days, and I guess
A retrospective.
a retrospect. And so I would, if I were editing him, I would end the second strophe with compendium, and I would put a space there, and then begin with "I'll vouch for you," and go on
That would be nice.
scrolling. And I wanted to say about the evangelist and the preacher is that when he's and we can go on scroll as though nothing had risen. And he, in order to write "And Nothing Had Risen," that takes some work. It's not close to the risen is not close to our tongues. You know, it's a sort of had risen is a kind of literary formulation, and it's about most familiarly the risen Christ.
Right.
Yeah.
As I was suggesting.
I'm also willing
Yeah.
to bet that the preacher shook his head, the evangelist balanced two comes from some movie, but I can't tell you what.
He
so
certainly
many
did
of his
take
things
lines
come
from
from
movies.
that it looks like something. I can picture a movie where you see the preacher, it's black and white, the preacher shook his
It's like
head.
a Western.
Yes.
Whatever. I don't
Yes.
know what the film would be, but knowing how
Or
it
a
works.
Willie Nelson song. The preacher shook his
It
head.
really is a Willie. It's
We
a
could
country
look it
song.
up. I mean, if you put
Yeah.
these lines
Well, it's
into
almost
Google,
as if
if you put the lines into Google, you might come up with a film.
Which is a lot
Right.
of Ashbery. I don't want to say scholarship, but annotation. I mean, somebody is going to do the big collective
Yeah.
with
Right,
annotations.
right.
And,
Yes.
and we really need to figure all that out.
Good thing we
but I
have
do
Google.
think, in a
It's a good
sense,
thing, yeah.
it's interesting when you were earlier saying that you felt like the first part of the poem was preparing for the second part as this little vignette. But the little vignette is, just very solitary and actually sort of reminds you that it is, again, reiterating what has already been iterated, that this balancing and the shaking, there's no conclusion drawn from either evangelist or preacher who blur into one another.
On
right?
one reading of this poem, at the very end, my eyes welled up, thinking about John's recent passing,
Yes.
thinking about we'd gone too far, we'd have to come back in a day or two. Actually, tomorrow, he will get up again and write another poem tomorrow. I mean, I think he wrote every day that he could possibly do it, and some days the poems were great, and some days the poems were not so great, and he didn't particularly, really, I think, care or distinguish one of those days from the other. And again, I know it's a metapoetic reading, but we'd have to come back in a day or so. Stay tuned for more of this time.
I'm wiping my...
Yes.
That's so, I was very moved by that in one reading of the poem,
Yes.
thinking, well,
We can't do that
we
anymore.
can't do that anymore, although there are plenty of poems.
And what about, did you ever hear from the one who said he'd be back?
Oh, I love
once
that.
it was over, who eluded me
I
even
think
in
it
my
could be a
sleep.
Bergman movie. I'm looking
There
at
is
it.
something like
Now look at it. The preacher
The
shook his
seventh
head.
seal.
The evangelist balanced two spools at the end of his little makeshift rope. I mean, it's very visual,
spare,
really.
isn't it?
And what?
It's spare.
It's very
Usually
spare, but
his
it's very
little stories are
suggestive.
lusher than this.
You can just
I think
picture
it's
it in
an
a
old
film,
man
the preacher
poem.
shaking
Yes,
his head.
yes.
Very
Yes.
And I don't
spare.
know what the movie is, and
What
you
would
usually don't.
happen, though,
But
if-
when you look them up, you usually
He
find
watched a lot
they're
of
very
movies.
learned.
Right, I did.
There was one about the yak and the cabbage. That's a late poet that I wrote about, and I thought, well, that's just ridiculous, yak cabbage. And then I found out that that it was related to cauliflower and cabbage, and I mean what all the etymologies are. And when you do that, you usually find he knows exactly what
Well,
he's
for
saying.
someone who didn't like to explicate at all his own poems, you could say to him, yak and cabbage, John? And he'd say, well, there's a movie from 1947.
I would never say that.
Well, what-
I
Wouldn't
have no
annotate?
interest in saying
What would
that.
you think about, what if he had put those lines about the preacher earlier in the piece? I mean, they don't act as a closure for the poem, but they're kind of a pretend
Well, in my
closure.
reading, again, they
No,
do,
but
because
they
it's his saying, yeah, I can do this still. Look at this. I got a preacher, I got an evangelist. See me at work.
We're getting to religion at the end.
We'd gone too far.
Yeah.
We'd have to.
We've gone to, we'll
We've
have to
gone
come
to
back.
come back,
But the
yeah.
compendium to me seems like this big, vast crypt where every moment of time is pushed into, where you can't access it. It's a paper thin one. It's an archive you can't read. So it really makes you very aware that he's on this sort of very edge, that in the sleepwalking really becomes more treacherous. So it's whimsical at first, but then it feels more serious in a certain way.
We could talk about, who knew we could talk so long about this poem?
There's
But
more to
we-
say.
Because
There's more to
even late as this is still much more interesting than
And so
what
many.
about the
I mean, I don't think on PoemTalk we spend a lot of time comparing the poem we're talking about to all the other lessers. But here is a poem, we sort of randomly chose it, and there's so much to say, and it's so interesting, and even at times moving, and that's amazing in itself. No?
What do you
Amazing.
think about the line, I'm wiping my
Oh, I was just going to mention that's one fault.
Where is
of him.
that? Where is that?
That's a tick. That's Ashbery using an old tick. He has so often, instead of
pinch
calling
nose.
it glasses, instead
Oh.
of calling it glasses, to call it the pince nez.
It stands out as a
archaic.
sort of-
That's a little trite, I think.
Yes. It's
I
sort
think
of-
he
does
could
it
have
a lot.
changed that.
He
you know.
doesn't, by the way, Bob mentioned
That's
if he
falling
could
back
have
on
an
old
editor. He
habit. Yeah.
doesn't have
But
an
that's
editor.
the sort of illustration
Nobody
of
edits
the
these
old
things.
anthems.
Yeah, that's
He
Yeah.
himself might. Is it
Yes.
Echo? Did Echo publish him? Who published him?
Viking.
Viking. Oh my
Yes,
goodness.
Viking.
They didn't edit the
No.
poems, did they?
Of course, they don't edit.
Right. So it's really up to him.
Of
Yes.
course,
Yes.
completely.
And that's why some
And
of
he
the
writes
stuff
these
sneaks
very
in,
quickly.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
He
We
writes them
could-
very quickly.
So
and the funny thing
Friends.
is, when
Yeah,
you
go ahead.
start out reading them, you think, well, this is just Slider. But then you see even the Slider ones are
Yes.
pretty amazing.
Yeah,
Yes,
they are. Well, we
yes.
could talk about this poem and about Ashbery forever. So let's
Yes.
go one each. One final thought that you came here today wanting to say about Ashbery or about this poem. All four of us get a shot at it. Susan, are you ready, or should we skip you?
Skip me.
Okay, Marjorie, one
What-
final thought.
what did we
Bob,
I don't know what to say.
I was thinking of the leaps between sentences, the gaps between sentences, which I mentioned, and I wondered whether I wonder what the manuscripts look like, because one reads
interesting.
One reads him as if
Yes.
you're trying to track a very thoughtful and witty mind as it moves with a kind of intimacy that doesn't provide conjunctions, doesn't make the connections. I wonder if he actually crossed out sentences
Yes.
because there's
That's
a
a
kind
good-
of curatorial element to his poems, like the pince nez and
Yeah, yeah.
the rascal jumping over the fence. It's like from somewhere else.
Yes,
In comes a
yes.
rascal jumping over a fence, and he likes that from somewhere else
Yes.
sense of the poetry. And we could say, this is Ashbery, and what about Ezra Pound and those leaps? You know, the much bigger leaps, and we don't.
and the leap could be compositional. I mean, famously,
Yeah.
he would have just tons of scraps of paper near the bedside or the reading table, right, Marjorie? Lots of scraps of paper. And some of the poems borrow from what's on the paper. There you have a leap. He's importing something,
Right.
right?
Yeah, I think
From the archive.
Ashbery's one weakness, and that has always been true, is structure in the larger sense, macro structure, that often you have passages where they could be in another poem just as easily. Now you can say that
Just
about,
as easily,
Now
exactly.
you can say that about Henry James too. You know, there's the famous story of the chapters reversed in the Ambassadors, where nobody noticed it for a long time. And Ashbery is that kind of writer. You can
And
take
aren't
that
they
second
similar?
stanza that you
Yes,
don't like as much
yes.
out and put it in another poem.
Yes.
And if I put this out right now, The Rascal, and that whole passage, and put it in another poem in the volume, you could try it out. You might not even notice it.
Right.
And that you
And a lot of
could
people would say that's a bad thing.
and you could, well,
Yeah,
you could
yeah.
say it gives it, our words must seem to have inevitability. I mean, it ruins that sense a little bit of inevitability. But if you're willing to go with that, I think the reason he's such a popular poet too, which is kind of amazing because he's so difficult, is that he does sum up the culture, our culture, in so many ways of that kind of equivocation in one mode that immediately slips into another. But I do wonder what will happen when that mood shifts, which it is going to shift now. It's already shifted, let's say, with Trump. I mean, in other words, we don't have that indeterminate
Did you
mood
refer
quite
to
as
Donald
much.
Trump in a PoemTalk episode?
What?
X that out.
Well, I
There's a
think-
$5 fine.
I think you have a very different
$10.
mood now, you know, and I think it is interesting to me, and I would predict that since he wrote so terribly much, and the two volumes alone have 2,000 pages, and that's only up to the year 2000. This isn't even in it yet.
Amazing.
So that's another 1,000 pages probably. So you're going to have 3,000 pages. How much did Wallace Stevens write altogether?
Not much.
No, 300,
couple of
whatever,
hundred
or even
pages.
yet. And so I do feel that a reaction is going to set in. Now, that's my guess. I mean, that's not a
But
cheerful thing to say. I think a reaction will set in and people will start being critical because they haven't been critical at all. But then it'll come back
Right.
in a different way, although pruned somewhat, because there is so much and so much of one mood in certain
Right.
ways that you know, I don't know what to compare it to, but I mean, nobody else has written
Stein,
that much.
maybe.
Thomas
Stein.
Hardy.
and then Stein is and nobody reads all
and
of
Henry
Gertrude
James,
Stein.
the
That's
aforementioned.
just it.
Right, yeah.
You see, it does play against you, or like late Wordsworth
Well,
or something.
yeah.
When you write so much,
Yes.
it does mean people are going to get fed up. And I know when I've taught Ashbery, I mean, it's been a while now, but even say 10 years ago, I know people said, like Nicole Krauss, our famous novelist,
Yeah.
they would get very angry and they'd say, come on, he's always writing the same poem.
Well, I think
it's
actually,
getting
though-
repetitive. And of course, in some ways, that's so.
So you people have blown apart my final words little marching through. Was that your final word?
Well, it's just
We
a
can come-
question, really.
No, I'm teasing you.
Yeah, I mean, I
so-
don't have a final word.
Okay, well, why don't we go to Susan
Well,
for
I
a
mean,
final
that's
word, and
very,
I'm sure.
but just building on both of you have stimulated multiple ideas, but the notion of him doing the same thing over and over used to annoy me, but actually
they're really
in the
good.
last few years, I've found them actually not to annoy me for the very reason
That's true.
that they are mechanically working, that you can depend on them to work in a certain way, but you also can get lost in them. And I was particularly struck, and this is my final word. My final word is that what I like about this poem, and I'm sure I could use any Ashbery poem to find this, but is the way it so aggressively and relentlessly pushes against this idea that poetry is this dwelling place, this perfect dwelling place, and that it's sealed off from everything
true.
outside of itself. And then building on what Marjorie was saying, that this sort of sense that we're seeing an edge, it's as if he's deftly smudging out any chance of completion, but this ability
It's a way of staying alive, by the way.
Yes, and this ability to stay in the conversational mode, even though you're enunciating things that others will not understand, is this contract with the reader that allows you to really dwell in a place where actually he's saying poetry is not the sonnet where you dwell. And so that's why he has, say, in the beginning of lines, we regurgitate, end word, regurgitate, ugly word, or whatever, and old anthems, what has come to pass, and why dwell on these? That word dwell struck me because he doesn't dwell, and yet this
Why
ability
make things more
to
difficult than they already are?
Well, why make things more difficult than they are? Because that is a way to keep going, because there's always more to say.
Yeah, but he doesn't. But I think that's quite true. That it isn't that notion of the poem that sort of, it's very what should I say?
Heideggerian, very non-Heideggerian.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank
my
God.
final thought follows from that.
Yeah.
So Marjorie talked about something that's changed in the era marked by the T-man.
Yeah,
So I'm not
the
being
Moss.
fined $5 because I didn't say Trump. Oops,
I would.
just-
I don't allow people
but
to say that word.
A parallel to what Marjorie said about things that could change. I didn't know John Ashbery very well, but I knew him well enough to know, and he often would say this in conversation, he would insist that he's not a strong ego. He wouldn't use that language, right? He didn't really know who he was. He would complain or claim that he really was very sort of unformed, he would claim. And that enables this. And
Absolutely.
I think that's
now
true.
that
Beautiful.
it coincides with an era in which the self or identity is flattened for a lot of young people, right? It is variable, it's fluid, etc. That we could move to a time when the reassertion of that clearly identified ego, the strong ego, reasserts
I didn't
itself.
mean that so much. I
No, I
meant
know. I was saying,
ideology. Yeah.
I was saying something different,
Yeah.
but parallel to that, a worry. Stevens called his poems overall the whole of harmonium. Well, that was BS because he wrote very distinct, separate poems, even at the end. Although you could say it's the same thing over and over. This really is, the compendium really is the whole Ashbery,
Right.
again and again
That's true.
and again.
Yes.
I think that's a good point. Very
And
good point.
it goes on. Marjorie, you didn't get a final word. You get one if you want.
No,
Any
was
final
that my
thought?
final word? Well, a
get an
final word.
extra
I
final
agree.
word.
I agree with Susan that I think it's amazing how powerful Ashbery still is. I mean, so much poetry and so many people have imitated him. We're just waiting to have studies of that. But there's not only the first generation of David Shapiro, John, that whole generation, Ann Lauterbach. but the next generation of Adam Fitzgerald, Tim Donnelly, all those people, Adam Fitzgerald, who was his assistant and who's sort of done well, and I think he's sort of aware of it in a way. I mean, Ashbery has had an incredible influence, but not necessarily for good, because you can't imitate him. I mean, of course, that's true of all very good people.
You can imitate him, but you can't do it
No,
well.
but
Right.
it's especially bad
Partly
in
because
his
you have
case.
to have that
The
ego
imitations
thing.
are especially bad because most people, what they don't have that he has is that ability, negative capability,
Yes,
first of all.
to the maximum
To be
degree.
able to move from one thing to another, not a strong ego, but also that he's so learned, that he has everything at his fingertips, which most younger people do not have at all. And so they sort of try to put in these things, clever things and phrases and so
Right.
forth, and, thinking that's all you have to do, put in Hollywood or put in movies, and it doesn't really work. He actually, for him, he still is a poet, and that's unusual today, who life and art aren't that separate, because he really did talk just this way, and he thought this way. I mean,
Yes.
you could do it, and he does it in his letters. If you look at those letters to Mark Ford, which are in the current PN Review, Mark Ford put in a compendium of letters. He was crazy about Mark Ford. He sort of had a kind of crush on Mark Ford. That wasn't quite returned, in that way. Okay, but he tells all the funny things that happened to him, and awful things that are happening, and how mad he is about this or that. And
And you could excerpt it.
We'd gone
lineate
too
it.
far. We'd have to come back in a day or two. I mean, they're just things like that.
Yes.
And that is the way his mind works. And what it does show about poetry is, at its best, when it's like this, it's inimitable because it's his sensibility, and nobody else has a sensibility.
Yeah.
You can tell an Ashbery poem a mile away, whether an early
Yes, you
one or a
can.
later one.
And we might, when we see many or some of the letters finally, we might start seeing things that come into the poem. We like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, which is a chance for us to spread wide our narrow hands to gather a little something really poetically good to hail or commend someone or something going on in the poetry world. So who wants to make a recommendation? Gather some paradise? Bob?
I've just finished reading August Kleinsaler's Selected Prose, and a collection of memoirs and critical essays. And I think he's a terrific poet, but he's also really a great writer of paragraphs and of essays, very shapely prose. It's a wonderful book.
Great
I had
recommendation.
a great time with it.
Thank you. Marjorie, recommendation?
Well, I've just done a review for TLS on Donald Judd's writings, and what occurred to me working on that is what an important genre in Ashbery's day, or a little earlier, artists' writings are. Smithson, Carl Andre, Donald Judd isn't as good as they are. And of course, John Ashbery was friendly with a lot of those people. But how, talking of paragraphs and so forth, how interesting and poetic that writing is. And there really is a book that remains to be written on that. What happens when artists have always written things, Joshua Reynolds or whatever, but not things that are poetic. And Smithson, who was always very poetic, and Judd in his own way, is as the writings are being treated almost that way. So that's a kind of interesting development that has gone on now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, every day's a new year for me, practically. But I'm reading about Edith Sitwell, and she's a very interesting woman. And the one thing I want to say is she won this wonderful libel case that would never be won today. Is that a critic said that she was going to oblivion. This fits with Ashbery's poem, and she sued him for saying that she was in oblivion, and she won £450 each for her and Osbert. And the judge said, one of the lawyers said to her, "Why you always criticize others? Like you compared this poet to cheap linoleum," and the judge said, "Well, that's very true. Bestsellers are like cheap linoleum," and so she won the case.
Remarkable.
I read about that too.
That's great. She had just the brother Osbert. Wasn't there another
Just
Sitwell?
Sakharov, yeah.
Sakharov, of course.
Yes.
Yes. of
Interesting
course.
bunch.
But it's true that Gertrude Stein wrote so very much too, and that's interesting. The fate may be a little bit similar. The problem when you do write that much is then people can't deal with it. It's just too much, which has been sort of Gertrude Stein's fate in a way. Nobody can really deal with all that writing, and you've had dissertations and books that deal with one book where they obviously have never read all her other writings. But
It's a sort of bulwark, a
it's
protective
really hard.
bulwark as well.
What?
It's
a compendium, yeah. It's too much of a compendium. It's hard to deal with. It's much easier to deal with people who are more confined, in a way.
This is not my Gathering Paradise, but a Sitwell footnote
Oh,
in a recent novel by T.C. Boyle, who lives up the road,
yes.
Santa Barbara-ish.
Yes.
There's a silly character who owns 3 dogs, and they are Sackrel, Osbert, and Edith. Well, I have 2 little Gathering Paradises. One is the aforementioned Henry James. Talk about like non-egos or whatever it is that he was suffering from, you know. I think of Henry James and John Ashbery together so
Absolutely.
much.
Oh, yes.
Really amazing.
I'm just listening to the Golden Bowl again now on Audible, and I just can't get over. And by the way, I think I found the source for "To Prepare a Face to Meet the Faces That You Meet."
yeah.
That's right. And Maggie knew that she now had to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. It's right
Brilliant.
in
Maggie
there. In the
Vernon.
Golden Bowl, and it comes up twice.
Right.
It's when she's trying, when Amerigo already knows that she knows,
Yes.
and she has to prepare herself, and other people, and it's that she prepared her face, and then it comes up again. And he was preparing, she could tell he was preparing his face. But
That's lovely.
I thought and
That's
you know,
lovely.
I mean,
Great
I'm
novel.
sure
Great
where
novel.
Eliot, who certainly knew James well, it's so amazing, isn't it?
yeah.
I was driving in the car and hearing that, and I gasped. I thought, there it is, that's the line.
Well, that's great.
That's a great
this is a bonus round. And we're talking about the Golden Bowl, and my favorite scene in it is when the shopkeeper brings the bowl. It's as if he's saying, who is it? Symbol deliverer. I'm the
much.
whole novel is right
It's
here
a
in my
little
hands.
much.
Who's going to figure out the
At one level, it's a crazy novel, isn't it?
It's
She's having the time
crazy.
of her life. She's always having the time of her life, finding
My
out.
second Gathering Paradise, because I came all the way to LA. I get 2.
Oh, this is the Gathering in Paradise?
Yeah, that's what
Oh.
we're doing, right?
I didn't
And
realize that.
my second one is, forgive me, PoemTalk itself. I just wanted to shout out to teachers, high school teachers and community college teachers in particular, who've contacted me and us over the years to say that they've made a selection of 10 episodes, choosing from the 120 or so different poets, choosing the ones that fit the lesson or unit, and then they assign those poems, and then the students read the poem, listen to the poem talk in a period, and then they get to talk about it. And then the next period, typically, they will try that on their own.
Oh, that's very nice.
You know, and I think in the age of easy podcasts or videos, why aren't students sitting around like we are, trying their hand at essentially copycatting
it's
this
great.
mode? I think it's a great mode.
It
So
would if you gave them half a chance. Yeah.
exactly, let's give them half a chance. So that's a good use of PoemTalk. Well, that's all the evangelists balancing 2 spools we have time for on PoemTalk today. PoemTalk
look
at
it
the
up
Writers'
online.
House is
Yes,
a
if I can
collaboration
find
of the
it.
Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing and the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania and the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundation.org. Thanks so much to my guests, Bob von Hallberg, Susan McCabe, Marjorie Perloff, and to PoemTalk's director and engineer today, Zach Cardner, and to PoemTalk's editor, the same amazing Zach Cardner. And once again, thanks to Zach for coming all the way out here to the left coast. And once again, thanks so much to Marjorie for hosting us here. And a shout out to Nathan and Elizabeth Light for their very generous support of PoemTalk. In our next episode, I'll be back in Philadelphia, joined by Sawako Nakayasu, Donato Mancini coming in all the way from Vancouver, and Gabriel Ojeda Segay to talk about 2 short poems by Suyen Juliet Lee. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us for that or another episode of PoemTalk.
Thank you, Al.
Thank you.
That was
Thank you so
fun.
much.
Yay! Yay us!
Yay, that was fun.
That was
Wasn't
good.
that good?
Make-